So I've got the answers for all your burning questions. Here's a good question. What's the difference between a brushed and brushless tool, power tool? Well, most of the ones we keep are brushless, but we're going to talk about the primary difference between the two. So I drew a little picture here. This is kind of to represent the actual motor itself. On a brushed tool, you've got a commutator, you've got brushes, little springs, and that's your connector point to tie into the electronics. And the way this thing works, and it's not necessarily going to be two brushes. On bigger tools, you may have an extra brush here and here, but they're always going to be even numbers, as far as I know. I've never heard of a odd number of brushes on a tool. So what happens is when you activate the tool, when you apply current to the motor, essentially, one side, the current goes in one side and comes out the other. And these are carbon, they're like graphite maybe. I forget what they're made of. It's some kind of carbon material, but that brush pushing against that commutator, that's what makes your electrical connection. And when you apply current to it, it creates a circuit, and that circuit is what makes the motor turn. On a brushless motor, there's no connection between the motor and the source of power. So what you got is basically, this shaft rides on a bearing on each end, which this has a bearing on each end too. But this outer shell here, these are magnetized. Okay, there's a whole bunch of magnets inside this thing, and whenever you want to apply power to this, you pull your trigger. There's I believe it's called a Hall effect sensor. Basically, it's a sensor that tells the electronics in the motor where the shaft is in relation to everything else. And what'll happen is these are actually much more tightly packed than this, but these little nubs, current is applied to those, and they're like wound up copper coils, and that creates a magnetic field. And with the brain box inside these drills, or not necessarily drill, but any brushless power tool, these are activated in sequence. A current's applied to it and let off, so that creates a temporary magnet. Changes the pole or the polarity of the magnet. So as it goes, it's timed to where it does all the way through. And it's actually going to be a cross section. And it's the way I drew this, but it's all the way around. Everything's in balance. And that attracts, and this one will activate, and it'll draw that one this way, that one will activate and draw that one that way, so on and so forth. And these fire in sequence, and that's what creates your torque. There's no drag here. So when talking about efficiency, that's where the efficiency bonus comes from. This is more efficient because there's not, you're dragging this commutator over these brushes, and these do wear down over time. With this guy, there's no drag. Or at least not. You still got bearings and gear trains and stuff. It's going to introduce some parasitic loss, but much more efficient. So if you take two identical tools, similar outputs, similar size, same battery, you get longer runtime out of the brushless motor. Other advantages. On the DC motor the brushed motor, when you're trying to go slowly, the only way you can control the speed here is to control how much current you're sending through. So when you are just lightly pulling the trigger, instead of sending everything it can at it, it's only sending a very small amount of current into this system. So that's what causes it to burn slow, but that limits your torque significantly. It's the reason why on a brush tool, they're very easy to torque out. Like if you're trying to drive a screw really slowly, these are really easy to torque out. And you don't want to torque these out, because what will happen is that brush will get stuck in one spot. It can cause a hot spot on this commutator, and it can damage it if you do it a lot. It can warp it, or it can actually burn it. That's if you ever watch a YouTube video where somebody's like playing with a power drill, and then suddenly smoke starts boiling out of, and it's all dramatic, and oh look, I tore my stuff up, oh my god. Well, that's why. It's because they bound it up, and they're applying current to this commutator, and it can't go anywhere, so it gets hot, and eventually it'll melt and burn up You know, with an AC motor, that doesn't happen because there's no direct connection here because you got batteries. So what'll happen is if you're trying to just go slow, you just barely pull the trigger. You're still sending the same amount of current. You're still creating just as strong of a magnetic field. It's just that your timing is slower. So you don't lose. You still lose low speed torque compared to going full speed, but it's not as dramatic of a difference. And also, if the drill binds up, I mean, you still don't want to have these. You don't want these windings to constantly get current. You want them to hit and then cut off, because you can still burn these up, but they're more resistant to it than a brush system is. So just, you know, if you abuse the tool, you're less likely to damage it because of that system. Brushless motors are pretty cool. I mean, you can have these, can be DC or AC. I know a lot of on the Milwaukee. I don't know if any of their tools are actually AC. I think some of them actually are. I think their more high end stuff is. But that's kind of beyond the scope of this. Mostly, I just wanted to show you what the primary difference is, like mechanically, how they work, and why they're different, and why it matters. There's nothing wrong with brush motors, though. Brush motors are perfectly fine. I still have several in my collection. Biggest advantages are cheap. They're a lot cheaper. You know, like talking about, for example, like the 12-volt hacksaw. I always buy the brushed version for two reasons. One, it's smaller than the brushless version. It's actually significantly smaller. And yeah, there is a power difference and there's a runtime difference. I get that, but it's so much cheaper that if I tear the dang thing up by submerging it in water, or if I lose it, I'm not going to cry quite as much. And also smaller. Brush motors tend to be smaller because, you know, you've got a lot of extra circuitry going on here. So AC motors tend to be slightly larger. And depending on the tool, depending on the form factor of the tool, that can have a pretty big effect on how big the fit tool actually is. But yeah, that's I think that pretty well covers the depth I want to cover with this. You can jump down a major rabbit hole learning about this stuff, and I encourage you to do so because knowledge is power, absolutely. But if you ever have any questions come up about this kind of stuff, just like I say in every one of these, call me. Have a good one.